Hi, as those of you who follow me here on this channel or on Substack already know, this Greenland business has prompted me to focus on Denmark, the Danish military and Danish military policy. I made a video on this very topic last week. I've put a link here above me to that video. And I've also put links to my written work in the description below. The more I learned about Denmark, the more interested I became, the more interesting this became to me. And I thought it would behoove me to reach out to some actual Danish defense experts to share some of their knowledge, as much for my edification as for yours. So today I am honored by the presence of not one, but two professors at the Royal Danish Defense College in Copenhagen, Denmark, Olivier Schmitt and Esben Larsen. Olivier is somebody that I followed now for many years. I think of him as the academic that I would like to be if I went back to academia, because he keeps writing the books that I want to write. And I think, oh, I'd love to write a book about that. And then lo and behold, I discover that, oh, that's what he's working on. I've put some links to some of his work in the description below. Now, as it happens, Olivier is actually French. He's not Danish. And he is a reserve officer in the French Air Force, which I actually think is an advantage, because that means he perhaps brings to the subject of Danish defense policy a little bit of the kind of distance that you get from being an outsider. He also has a French, a European, and dare I say, a NATO perspective. Esben is an officer in the Danish Air Force, as well as a scholar, with experience ranging from staff work and strategic planning to commanding an air defense unit. Among other things, Esben has contributed to this study, the title of which translates as Defense in the Arctic, Sovereignty, Cooperation, and Security. It's worth noting that this work discusses various scenarios conflict scenarios that relate to Greenland. Although as far as I could tell, one of the scenarios that does not exist in this work, in other words, that it's not considered, is any potential confrontation between Denmark and the United States. Like that just wasn't thought. Esben has done a lot of fascinating work on military geography, the military geography of Denmark, and how Danes perceive its strategic geography, which I think is directly relevant to this discussion. And by the way, if I understand it correctly, both of you have done your time in Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, but I
Yes.
want to mention I was there as a civilian, not as a military officer.
Okay. That's fair. That still counts, particularly since I was there as a civilian. So I think that's important. Okay, so I want to start asking some questions here. And I thought about different ways of going about it. And I thought that probably ultimately we don't have any choice but to directly confront the elephant that's in the room, which is Greenland. And I thought I'd want to start with you, Esben, to ask how, sort of, as particularly given the work that you've done on Danish defense thinking and the Arctic and the geography, Danish military geography, what did you make of all this? I mean, was this all a shock to you?
I think most were shocked about the American approach. But I would like to mention that up to that, we have been thinking the Arctic and the military in Denmark in terms of capabilities. If you look at the latest defense agreements on adding more military to the Arctic, it has been about identifying the right capabilities to field for the Arctic. What we have not been thinking so much about is the actual geography, military geography, and the task associated with Greenland. It is true we have been thinking much about the Coast Guard duty and making sure we have situational awareness of the ships around Greenland, but the real military task, we have been thinking more in terms of capabilities.
So generic capabilities as opposed to actually thinking about Greenland.
Yeah, I would say so to a certain degree, also because there's this command relation when you look at the US side, where you have changed actually Pituffik and made that part of another command rather than SACEUR, where we in Denmark has been putting staff officers into Joint Force Command Norfolk and the regional plan being developed for NATO there for the area.
So, okay, that's something I want to talk about that later. Because I think that's interesting. That's something I hadn't really considered about the ramifications of the U.S. switch from European Command to NORCOM. I just wanted to turn to Olivier very briefly, like in general, your thoughts, like in terms of your response to suddenly the emergence of basically, an American threat against Denmark.
Well, I'm going to be French and speaking on behalf of the Danes here, so it will be a weird mix of considerations, if that's
It's
okay.
fine. That's okay.
But you have to remember that at least the Trump one administration had already made an offer to buy Greenland back in 2019, which took the Danish government by, I think it's fair to say, by surprise over summer. Already in January last year, there were some discussions, including a very tense phone call between Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister, and President Donald Trump. So it was not coming completely out of nowhere. I have the impression that the Danish system was sort of knew that it was on the cards in the administration in Washington, but was sort of hoping that the attention span of the administration will direct the president's interest somewhere else. So when it came back in early 26, it was not entirely a surprise. What I think was a bit of a shock was the apparent brutality with which the administration and the president signaled that they wanted to take territorial control of Greenland, but also the very dismissive way about which they have been talking about Denmark as a making it seem as either completely disinterested in Greenland, a small country that cannot defend itself and therefore has no value. And then we've also seen in some corner of the more conservative press some kind of almost Russia-like type of propaganda whereby Greenlanders would have been subject to horrendous subjugation from the Danes and therefore needed to be freed from Danish oppression. And I think the tone really made a huge difference in terms of perception of the intensity and aggressiveness of the ways the request, let's put it that way, was carried.
See, thank you. So many questions to ask. I thought that it would be useful, given the two of you, your expertise, if we were to talk about sort of Danish defense policy up until this point. I think it's useful to try to understand how Danes think about the world in terms of strategy and in terms of their relationship with the United States and with NATO. So speaking with that, like if we could somehow characterize this, like if we can walk us through since, like World War II and then moving forward. Esben, perhaps you want to begin?
Yeah, if you want to go all the way back to World War II,
Sure.
Denmark failed at neutrality in World War II and came out of World War II also with the notion of never again on 9th of April, the very humiliating and very fast defeat we suffered to Germany. So Denmark enters NATO and become an ally there and base its military strategy on that, to be basically facilitating reinforcements as a front line nation in NATO. Later on, at the end of the Cold War, we turned towards a more expeditionary mode. We have deployments to the Balkans, to ex-Yugoslavia, and then later on in the next century, next decade, to Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. Whereas the military strategy is built on deploying forces, tactical units, but with strategic intentions of signaling cohesion, to signal to the US and others that we are, even though we are small, we will deliver when we are asked to deliver military force. So we have this very capability-oriented way of thinking when the Crimea is annexed by Russia. And it's actually something that we still try to do. We try to deploy, instead of Afghanistan, we deploy units to Latvia and try to show our commitment to the alliance that way. Then came the major Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that profoundly changed the outlook in the Danish uh, defense policy. I would say you have a complete change towards territorial defense and towards seeing and a keen interest in supporting Ukraine in a big way. So we see this major change, but still a focus on. So we go from an expeditionary focus to a focus on deterrence in Europe.
Is that post-Cold War, no, is this new post-2022 focus simply a reversion to the Cold War focus, or is the way of thinking changed?
It has changed profoundly in the way that you can say we were not a very strong. Some have labeled it we were a ally with some reservations during the Cold War. We still had some mentality left over from the neutrality years. We had the footnotes in the 1980s where we do not want US nuclear weapons on Danish soil in peacetime, with an exception for Greenland, by the way. And but that changes in the 90s where we want to be like the good ally. We want to be the impeccable ally. And that impeccable ally we also try to be now in the way of defense spending, in the way we want to help Ukraine, and in our commitments to the NATO deterrence in the Baltic states.
Thank you. Olivier, does this track with your understanding of the history of Danish defense policy?
It does. I think. I will not repeat what Esben has mentioned because it's entirely true. I'll maybe just try to provide a bit of the political context, especially post-Cold War. What happened with Denmark post-Cold War is that Danish prosperity is based on international trade, fundamentally, right? There is a number of core Danish companies that are known worldwide. Lego, Velux, Novo Nordisk, you might have heard of it recently. One of the largest shipping companies in the world is Danish. It's based in Copenhagen, Maersk. So Danish prosperity was basically based on the fact that the United States was providing this kind of global commons to globalization economy, and Denmark bandwagon or participated to this broader movement of helping the United States provide for the global commons, therefore facilitating international trade and international cooperation. I think the Danish defense policy must be understood within this broader framework of prosperity relies on international trade. Therefore, we are going to align with the power which is ensuring the condition of relatively safe international trade. And that explains why, some Danish analysts have called Danish foreign policy hyper-Atlanticist, especially shortly post-Cold War. And I think that it can be explained by that. A second feature of the Danish defense policy that Denmark drastically cut into its defense spending after the Cold War. And because it was regularly berated by NATO allies, even before 2014 and 2022, for very small defense spending, they decided to compensate by being hyperactive, basically saying, okay, we have little money in our defense system, but we have great value in what we are providing. That goes a long way in explaining the Danish commitment to the war in Afghanistan alongside with the British. They were part of the British area of operations in Helmand, and they fought gallantly and valiantly alongside British troops because, Danish soldiers are as competent as anyone else in NATO and probably more than most NATO countries. But there was this broader sense of compensating underinvestment with overcommitment to actual operations to say, well, we can actually do things. As has been mentioned, 2014 and especially 2022 have been massive transformations of that model, one of which has been a strong reinvestment in defense spending since 2022, which is absolutely phenomenal if you look into in GDP terms. And it is possible because Danes have a sound fiscal model, right? So they can borrow at very low cost, so they can increase their defense spending without having to do too much of the hard trade-offs of cutting somewhere else. The second change that has been happening, especially under the Mette Frederiksen government, is that North America or NATO are no longer the only security policy options. It is very clear that since 2022, Mette Frederiksen has engaged a turn towards Europe. For a very long time, Denmark had an opt-out in European security arrangements. That opt-out was lifted 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, Esben, after a referendum. And since then, Denmark has basically been learning European defense cooperation, from which it kind of self-excluded over the past 20 years. And it's something new in Danish defense and security policy. So on top of the Atlanticism that was already there from the 90s, there is also a kind of new strand of policy activities that are meant to be developed into a European context. And in that sense, Denmark is converging towards other European nations in that regard.
Thank you very much. So I want to unpack this idea of Denmark being a frontline state, because I don't think that's something that's obvious, certainly not to Americans. What does that mean? How is Denmark a frontline state, or how was Denmark a frontline state? And then what does that do in terms of its thinking of priorities and the kind of military that it needed to have?
It was during the Cold War, because you had the Danish Straits was the access to the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, especially in the first part of the Cold War, where Soviet submarines needed to they were mainly based in the Baltic Sea and have to go through the Danish Straits out to the Atlantic. Later on in the Cold War, these submarines become nuclear and move to the Kola Peninsula, and then the importance of the Danish Straits is reduced. But it is still a quite forward position. We have the island of Bornholm in the Baltic Sea that was then like a post some way in front of the front line down through Europe. So certainly a frontline state in the Cold War, not so much now, where we more see it as a RIA is such a misused term, but at least like a tactical support area for what goes on in the Baltic Sea. We have seen an increased activity of host nation support of troops coming into Denmark, being assembled, and then moves on into the Baltic states.
Okay, so is it fair to say that during the Cold War, the focus was much more immediate, the territory and waters of Denmark and the Danish Straits, and then now that focus has shifted towards the east into the Baltic, further away from Denmark itself, towards the Baltic and the Baltic littoral?
Yeah, there's an idea that when the contact battle will take place in the Baltics or Finland or northern Norway, and the significance of Denmark will more be like the tactical support area where we can expect air attacks. You have seen massive investments in ground-based air defense in recent years in Denmark. And you have also see this an area where there are a very real hybrid threat. So hybrid threats and air threats in Denmark per se, and then a support area for what goes on in a contact battle further east.
Are there no more Russian subs in the Baltic? Or are they all up in Murmansk?
I think they have one or two left in the Baltic Sea. Is very minimal what they have there. They of course have the shipyards, and you have exercises from time to time, but the Baltic Sea is no longer the main basing for Russian submarines.
one of the things that I puzzle over is, this sounds stupid, but the existence of the Danish army compared to like a Danish navy. Yeah, obviously you need a navy, and obviously you need an air force. But the Denmark, in terms of the decision making and the policy, does it even need as many tanks as it has, or as many kind of ground capabilities as it had, compared to, given the fact that priorities and resources are finite, maybe all the money should go into frigates or airplanes or air defense or something, or submarines, which you no longer have.
Yeah, you can make that argument. There's some history. During the Cold War, we relied on reinforcement to a large degree, and the policy or the idea was that we should be enforced with units that could easily reinforce. Heavy army units are not that transportable, so we had a balance between the services that's to some degree still exists. The 2-1-1, two for the army and one for the navy and one for the air force. That was an idea that arose in the 60s, and so the Danish army is considered to be per tradition the largest service. Then when you look at uh, the idea of the contact battle being something in the Baltics or in Finland or otherwise, you can look at the Danish population and the Danish economy and say what would be the fair share. And if you look at the NATO force model with 100,000 on high alert and 200,000 in a slightly uh, lower readiness, and see that the Danish GDP compared to as a percentage of the European NATO nations GDP is just about 1%, and the population is like 0.5% of or 0.7 in that range of the European NATO nations. You'll see is that the fair share of the NATO force model will be approximately a brigade size. So if you look at the GDP and the population relative to the other European NATO nations, a brigade will be kind of the fair share of that deterrence, and that matches very neatly up with that the Danish Army's primary unit would be a brigade that is deployable to the Baltic states.
Do you have any thoughts on the decision to get rid of submarines? I think I understand it, but I thought it'd be worth asking somebody who knows more than I do.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting because the role of the submarines during the Cold War was, besides, of course, being anti-invasion, it was also very much linked to intelligence gathering in the Baltic Sea. And you can say when they were closed down together with, by the way, ground-based air defense, it was very much because we were looking to the expeditionary warfare and saw what would be the universal capabilities there, and the more specialized capabilities was closed basically. And you can say today the traditional role of Danish submarines in the Baltic Sea have changed slightly because you have all along Kaliningrad you have NATO nations that can do the kind of electronic intelligence or signal intelligence you would otherwise use submarines for. So the discussion of submarines have turned more towards if you're a small state uh, in the Arctic or in the Northern Atlantic, then submarines might be a good idea. But the traditional role of submarines in the Baltic Sea for the Danish Navy is more or less changed.
And
Gotcha.
it's also
Particularly now that
related
Finland and
to,
Sweden are both in NATO.
yeah, I mean, of course, yeah. So, Finland and Sweden being in NATO completely changed the geography of defense in submarine defense for Denmark. But it's also related to what we're talking about earlier, which is considering the amount of cuts that happened in the defense budget after the Cold War, very hard choices were made out of a lack of money, very, very clearly. And I mean, I tell that story relatively often, but when I first joined the Defense College, we had regular briefings about the status of the Danish armed forces. And I nearly fainted when I realized that for a long time, not only the Danish Navy did not have any submarine capability, but they also did not have any anti-submarine warfare capability at all. So they just could not see what was happening underneath them. That has been patched since then because, again, new budgets and so on, but it also to give a sense of how deep the cuts were and how massive the reinvestment that is ongoing is.
Could you say more about the sort of lingering adherence to neutrality? You mentioned that, like in the Cold War, you could argue that Denmark was sort of a reluctant ally, or maybe not quite fully leaning into it, as perhaps as a legacy of its previous century, more than a century of neutrality. Am I characterizing correctly? Like, is there, in terms of the sort of embrace of NATO, the embrace of sort of alliance with the United States, is there sort of like a yes but or a distancing that was going on during the Cold War?
Yeah, also because if you look at the command structure, it was initially you had a very nationally oriented command structure, even in NATO. And you have the Joint Command for the Baltic approaches was stood up in the early 60s, which involved, of course, German officers. And there was, of course, as a former occupied country, there was very much resistance to having Danish forces under the command of German flag officers in that NATO setting. So that was the German side to it, and that we were naturally a part of a German-led command structure within NATO. Some arrangements was made. There was appointed a Danish commander for the Baltic approaches. The core in Schleswig-Holstein, you have a shift between a Danish and a German commander to alleviate the concerns over being as Danish troops being under the command of Germans. Then 15 years after the occupation. But
So it wasn't awareness of the United States; it was awareness about Germany.
initially, yes. Then you have the nuclear issue. You have quite a resistance to having nuclear weapons on Danish soil. I should also mention there was also a resistance to having foreign bases on Danish soil, but it was mainly focused on the nuclear side. Initially, when you have tactical nuclear weapons as part of the NATO strategy, Danish units had weapon systems that could actually fire it and had that potential to have a nuclear capability. But then you get later on a reluctancy to be part of the tactical nuclear capability, and you also get a resolution in the Danish parliament that Denmark in peacetime should not have based nuclear weapons, including American nuclear weapons. So it is more a non-nuclear thing than an anti-US thing, even though there might be something about it coincides with the Vietnam War and so forth.
So that I find that interesting because I read that Norway, of course, maybe I'm wrong about Norway, but I'm under the impression that Norway's reluctance about American nuclear weapons and having foreign bases in Norway and American bases in Norway stemmed from a desire to try to minimize the extent to which they were threatening the eyes of the Soviets. Is there some, to the extent that that's true, maybe I'm wrong. Please say so if you think I'm wrong. Is that not then what's going on in Denmark? In Denmark, it's not about not trying to be a threat to the Soviets. It's more about just distaste for nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the Norwegians have had a very explicit policy to be deterring without being too threatening. That has been kind of the paradigm. And you have a prime minister in Denmark who also have similar thoughts and then sent a letter to the Soviet leader Bulgarin about this, but finds out or that Denmark had not, since we are then have a different geographical position than Norway, being so close to as being a frontline state, cannot maintain on one part being slightly we cannot both facilitate relations with the Soviet Union and then being part of NATO and then being so dependent on reinforcement as we were at that time. So you see just a stint of it in the late 50s, early 60s that you have this idea. But you have in the Danish opposition ideas about nuclear-free zones and so forth in the 70s and the 80s, and quite a large peace movement. And you have the footnotes, of course, but not an idea like the Norwegian that you can be deterring and not that threatening because the geography did simply not allow for that.
So where does Greenland fit into all of this? I get the impression that Greenland just doesn't. It's just
Yeah, I think that's very correct. If you look at the Cold War, because the Cold War is very much, you have a massive US presence. You have initially, when the US came and NATO command structure was set up, the Danish commander on Greenland becomes Island Commander Greenland, and he contacts the Thule Air Force Base commander, and they talk about command relations. And I've seen this in the archives, and then he's told that you mind your Coast Guard business, and we will mind the big war, and that is kind of the setting all the way through. You should know that part of the picture is that the US used that massively for deterrence at that time. You have Thule is originally built as a B-52 forward base, and Kangerlussuaq was built in order to facilitate air-to-air refueling. The B-52 nuclear mission was a sustainment nightmare, probably because you have like 800 air-to-air refuelers associated with the Strategic Air Command to sustain that massive, and I think that's twice the amount of air-to-air refuelers that the U.S. Air Force has today overall. The number of aircraft,
800 in Greenland alone?
no, 800 to sustain both the
Sorry.
Pacific and the, but
Okay.
just my point here is that the presence was massive because it was not only the forward-based B-52s, it was also the sustainment structure that could keep them on flying alert high north at that time. And you have the Jew line, you had fighter aircraft associated with the Jew line, also in Greenland. So there was this massive presence that draws down in 68 when the final B-52 flying alert is removed from Greenland after a mishap where a B-52 crashes, and there's still some nuclear bombs that hasn't been found there. Interesting. And you have in the late 70s, some of the surveillance systems are drawn down, and that leaves the ballistic missile defense radar at Thule, now Pacific. The final Jew stations are closed down in 92 on the ice sheet of Greenland. The US actually put radar stations on the ice sheet. You also have the Camp Century, that was a US Army bid for nuclear deterrence. So they have this experimental camp on the ice sheets to see whether or not you can put missiles there. It didn't prove very feasible. So there's now under the ice sheet it is deserted remains of a U.S. Army base where you have contaminated water that you need to retrieve at some point.
Was that the secret thing that the Americans were digging out? I read something about this.
Yeah, it was secret
Denmark
to
was not aware of it, and then they're like, hey,
it
what's
was
this?
it was very like nuclear policy in the US in the 50s. They invited the Danish school children to stay there so they could see what a great idea it was to have a base on the ice sheet. So there was actually some Danish Boy Scouts who stayed there as a part of the public diplomacy surrounding one of the great ideas of the early nuclear age.
It's fascinating. I didn't realize that Thule was really ultimately about the B-52s. I had always assumed that it was a World War II thing.
It was actually built after World War II in a massive, but many of the other bases was really built as transit base initially for aircraft going from the US to Europe.
Right. Like I think all those B-17s that went to England flew through Greenland, or at least a lot of them, like Canada, Greenland, Ireland.
A funny note, there's actually been quite a few expeditions up there by aircraft enthusiasts from the US, because when you have a mishap where an aircraft landed on an ice sheet, it just sunk into the ice sheet. So you had the position, and since now vintage aircraft is very valuable, you have people who go up on the ice sheet and retrieve those aircrafts today.
That's great. So, was all this going on with the full blessing of the Danish government, or was the Danish government just thinking, well, what could we do about it?
Yeah, very much indeed, because the Americans asked in the 50s, you have this exemption that you will not have nuclear weapons on Danish soil. Does that also include Greenland? And the Danish prime minister sent secretly a letter to the U.S. with a very what you can call a non-answer. Say, we have this policy and we understand your situation. That's basically the message in that.
What does this then mean for Danish defense thinking? All right, so you've got this idea that Denmark is a frontline state. They're looking at the Straits, they're looking at the Baltic, they're looking at like Greater Scandinavia. But for Greenland, it's just not a factor because it's the wrong direction, because the Americans are taking care of it, because is that the way it works? It's just like they're not considering Greenland as part of the military geography of the realm.
No, it's something separate, and it's also at that time during you have these two major commands in NATO. You have SACEUR in Europe, and you have Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, and the way force goals are made to the nations at that time is that the two strategic commanders issue those, and Denmark is not asked to do much. They ask that the oceanic patrol vessels they have there do have some rudimentary anti-submarine warfare capability, and they ask that they have some presence up there, but essentially a peacetime coast guard, and then the ability to contribute to the escort duties at the Atlantic at that time.
So NATO wasn't asking Denmark to think about Greenland.
No, not really. You have in 77, when you have the drawdown, then the Americans asked Denmark to take over some of the functions. For instance, there's a rescue center they have to take over, and Denmark starts to have a more permanent presence of aircraft. We did have before that, some flying boats, primarily down at the Danish base in the south. But then we start to have a more permanent presence of aircraft, not really true MPAs, but some maritime reconnaissance aircraft, essentially business aircrafts, business jets with some surveillance equipment. And that's something we start to have a presence on Gangalusuaq from the early 80s on.
So then jumping back to post-2022, has anything changed? I mean, let's say in this narrow window between 2022 and the second Trump administration, has anything changed with respect to the way Denmark thinks about its own military geography and where it needs to be focusing in terms of where it needs to be and how it needs to be contributing?
You can say that you have, with the renewal of the agreement you have a renewal of the 1951 agreement with the US, where you include the Inuit population and have the Inuit leader to be co-signer of a renewed agreement in 2005. The extended self-rule enforced, and at the same time you start to consider that this global warming. So you have a update of this. You have an Arctic strategy that leads to some defensive investment, but it's seen more like a extended coast guard that is needed. There will be more ships due to climate change, and we need to have an eye. We need to have situational awareness of the primarily commercial activities that will take place around Greenland. That is a perception. And then you have in the first Trump administrations, in the end of that, you have Pompeo, who has a joint meeting with Denmark and the two self-rule governments of the kingdom, and you then have a discussion of what the needs could be, and very characteristically, it is translated into some capabilities. We will make a package of capabilities So they are not thinking so much about what is the task we need to solve, but the Americans is asking for surveillance and anti-submarine warfare capability. So we have these they literally make a capability package for that.
So not necessarily pointed at Greenland, but simply having these generic capabilities that could be
Some
pointed
pointed
at
at Greenland, but they could also be used elsewhere. But not to fulfill a certain defense plan of Greenland, more to have capabilities that matches what the Americans, Pompeo, said was needed. And then comes the Biden administration, and it kind of didn't get the attention it did before.
Olivier?
Um, it points to a general feature of how Denmark does military strategy, which to a large extent is about looking at what the NATO capability targets will be for Denmark, and then adjusting the requirements based on the NATO capability targets, how they are delivered. So you need to always think about like uh, Denmark sees a lot of its defense planning as being embedded within the NATO process itself. Therefore, if there was no strong signal coming from either the US or NATO to invest in specific capabilities regarding Greenland, the system tends not to generate those requests by itself. And I think this also why it explains a bit of the flabbergasted reaction in Copenhagen, because a lot of the reactions were, but we did what you asked us to do. And all of a sudden you are telling us that it was not enough, but it's more on you guys than on us then. So you need to understand that dimension of the Danish defense planning process.
I think that's important. I think that's something that Americans have no real understanding of. Just how NATO works and the whole the arbitrage, right? Like how the planning process works and how Denmark doesn't just make up on its own how it's going to invest its money. It's ultimately, it reflects a dialogue, right? That the decisions that the Danish government make reflect a dialogue with its allies about what do we need to be doing and what are our collective priorities, and then they go ahead and they move forward with that. So what happens now? I mean,
You tell us.
okay. I mean, so like, what I expect to happen is that Trump will announce a deal, right? And then there'll be a lot of fanfare. He's going to claim that he's got us the greatest deal ever, and that only he could make such a deal, and that this is this win-win thing. Everybody's great, but the deal is ultimately going to be the status quo, with a little twists, maybe a little bit of something, right? But they'll change the name or something. And so there'll be a new defense agreement, but it'll ultimately be the same thing as 1951, 2004. I mean, it will more or less be the status quo. It's just with a little bit of flourishes to make it look like it's different. But he'll proclaim this to be. But I think what I'd like to know, let's assume that's true. Does it mean that everything goes back to normal, or does Danish defense policy irrevocably change moving forward, based on the fact that it looks to me like all of the assumptions underpinning Danish defense thinking since World War II are now put in doubt about sort of the way the world works and who their friends are?
I see what's an important change would be that we have seen Greenland very much as a bilateral Danish-US thing. And I think the inclusion of European allies and the increased presence of NATO in Greenland will be something that we'll see also in the future. Also because it will be in the interest of European powers to do so. You will see, and that was already developing, you have the Joint Force Command Norfolk stood up some years ago, and they are making the regional plans that effectively should do something about ships around Greenland, so to speak. I think you will see a more vested Danish interest in those plans and that command, also because all the Nordic countries are now put under that command. So if a deal is reached, I think you will see more significance to the cooperation with NATO. You see more European presence in the defense of Greenland and other and in cooperation with the Danish Arctic Command, and you see a more focused effort of Danish presence in the Joint Force Command Norfolk, if that will be the new normal, so to speak. Interesting enough, it is an American general who has the responsibility to make the NATO plans for that area. But I think where the most significant change will come, and I'm not sure, but if I should make a qualified guess, I think a element that has been absent but would be more prevailing would be that so far NORAD has been this closed club that Denmark was not a member of, and they dealt with air defense in North America, and suddenly with the Golden Dome, Greenland is of interest to this. So you'll see the Danish defense policy will be forced to also cooperate with, my guess would be, the Canadians to find solutions. And you'll see that Danish defense funds will go to financing something that will be part of the Golden Dome, because I think my guess would be that would be part of a deal that could satisfy the current situation.
Does this mean that Denmark then shifts, right? So we've talked about how Cold War Denmark was shifted to almost like Danish waters, Danish airspace, the Strait. And then post Cold War or post 2014, now there's like a more focus eastward into the Baltic. And now, does this mean that the focus is going to shift back to the Arctic? Like, how much is this thing going to move around this focal point? I'm making stupid gestures in the air, but like,
I think that the focal point would turn to be to the Nordic, because we now with the other Nordic nations under Norfolk, and the North Atlantic would be an important focal point that also deals with ships close to Greenland. So I see that would be a shift in focal points that will go out to the North Atlantic. But I don't think that Denmark would escape having to pay its deterrence fee in form of a brigade to the Baltic states, but that would be kind of a sideshow. The main effort, the main thoughts would be with the Nordic defense concept and with the North Atlantic.
If we can frame it in that way, I think a lot of a big change will be that up until then, Denmark had to make sure that Russia was deterred and was contributing within a NATO framework. But Denmark now, and other European countries, by the way, will now have to redetermine and redefine the terms of their relationship with Washington. Something they basically have not done for the past 30 years, 30 plus years since the end of the Cold War. And so that will take a lot of the, well, at least some of the capacities, right? Some bandwidths will go into managing the relationship with Washington so that it does not turn hostile. And it's something that was completely outside of the realm of the imagination up until recently. But I think the focus will be to maintain a working and amicable relationship, which will not be the relationship that existed post-Cold War.
anything to add? I think we've covered a lot.
To Copenhagen, it's a great city. I will just
I'd
plug
love
it.
to go back.
I'll plug it that way.
No, it really is. I went to Tivoli Gardens even, and it was wonderful. It really is as lovely as people say. And of course, the Danish War Museum, I think, is really fabulous. I was very impressed by that. I learned all about the Danish-Swedish wars, which I had no idea happened. It's kind of interesting. I've noticed I have a Swedish friend who posted some negative comments to something I put about Denmark, and but they besieged the city of whatever in 16 whatever. Okay, great.
If there is one
All
thing
right.
I've learned as an immigrant in Denmark is that I have to criticize the Swedes in every single conversation.
Really?
Esben laughs because he knows it's true.
Among the Scandinavians, is there one of the countries? Like the French make fun of Belgians and tell like Belgian jokes, like who Who are the butt of Danish jokes?
Norwegians?
Yeah, Norwegians, I would say so.
Norwegians, yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Mm.
that's what I thought. I've heard people say that Norwegian language compared to Danish is sort of like hillbilly to Danish
Well,
ears. It's
that's
kind
what
of
Danes would say. Again, as an immigrant having to learn the language, I will say that modern Norwegian is properly pronounced Danish, but um, they will kick me out of the country for saying this. So
I
No,
get you.
Norway and Denmark was one country until the Napoleon Wars. So we are the languages are the closest. So we say that Norwegians are people who cannot spell because they have the same words, spell them slightly different.
Fair enough. Wow. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think this has been really interesting. I learned a lot. I presume anybody's watching this is also going to learn a lot. And thank you. Thank you for giving me your time.